The rain hammered against the windows of Mercy General Hospital like angry fists, each drop carrying the weight of another exhausting 12-hour shift. Imani Williams pulled her scrubs closer as she stepped into the elevator, her dark skin glistening with perspiration. Her usually perfect curls now pulled back in a messy bun that spoke of another day spent saving lives while barely keeping her own together. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across her tired face as she checked her phone. 3 missed calls from the landlord. Her stomach dropped like a stone. The elevator dinged softly as it reached the ground floor, but the sound felt like a death knell. Imani knew what those calls meant. Her rent was already 2 weeks late, and Mr. Rodriguez had been patient, but patience only stretched so far when you own buildings in downtown Atlanta. She stepped out into the lobby, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, past the gleaming donor walls filled with names of wealthy benefactors who could write checks that would solve all her problems without even noticing the money missing from their accounts. The automatic doors whooshed open, releasing her into the storm that had been brewing all day. The wind cut through her thin jacket like ice, and within seconds her scrubs were soaked through. She pulled out her phone to call a rideshare, but the screen showed what she already knew. Insufficient funds. The words stared back at her like a cruel joke. Here she was, a registered nurse who spent her days in the cardiac intensive care unit, literally keeping hearts beating, and she couldn't even afford a ride home. The bus stop was 6 blocks away, and with each step the storm seemed to grow more vicious. Rain pelted her face, mixing with the tears she refused to let fall. This wasn't how her life was supposed to turn out. She had worked so hard to get through nursing school, taking double shifts at a diner while studying until her eyes burned. She had dreams of making a difference, of having a family, of stability. Instead, she was walking home alone in a thunderstorm, about to lose the tiny apartment that represented everything she had managed to build. As she turned the corner onto her street, Imani's heart sank even further. The old brick building that housed her studio apartment looked more run down than usual in the harsh streetlight, its fire escape rusted and creaking in the wind. The gentrification happening all around her neighborhood had pushed her rent up while her salary stayed the same. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs, each step heavier than the last, knowing that tomorrow she would have to face Mr. Rodriguez and beg for more time she didn't have. Her keys jingled as she fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking from both cold and exhaustion. The hallway smelled like cooking grease and old carpet, a sharp contrast to the sterile cleanliness of the hospital. She was so focused on getting inside and dry that she almost missed the figure huddled against the wall next to her door. At first glance, he looked like any other person seeking shelter from the storm, but as Imani's eyes adjusted to the dim hallway light, she realized this was no ordinary situation. The man was wearing an expensive suit, now soaked and wrinkled, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. But what made her freeze in place wasn't his obvious wealth or the way he seemed completely out of place in her building. It was the tiny bundle he was clutching against his chest. Baby. A newborn by the size of it, wrapped in what looked like a hospital blanket that was now damp from the storm. The man's eyes were closed, his face pale and drawn, and he was breathing in short, shallow gasps that made Imani's medical training kick in immediately. She knelt beside him, her own discomfort forgotten as she pressed 2 fingers to his neck. His pulse was rapid and weak, his skin clammy despite the warmth of the building. The baby stirred in his arms, letting out a soft whimper that cut through the sound of rain against the windows. Imani looked closer and saw that the infant was maybe a week old, with the delicate features and slightly wrinkled skin of someone who had just entered the world. The blanket was barely adequate for the weather, and the baby's lips had a slight blue tinge that sent alarm bells ringing in Imani's head. "Sir," she said softly, touching the man's shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, revealing the deepest green she had ever seen, but they were filled with a pain that went far beyond physical discomfort. When he tried to speak, his voice came out as barely a whisper, rough and broken. "Please," he managed, looking up at her with desperation that made her chest tight. "Help us." Can you imagine finding yourself in Imani's position, exhausted and struggling, only to discover someone even more desperate at your doorstep? What would you do? Subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think Imani should do next. Imani stared down at the man and baby for a moment that felt like hours. Every instinct told her to call 911, to let the professionals handle this situation, but something about the way he looked at her, like she was his last hope in the world, made her hesitate. She thought about her empty bank account, her overdue rent, her own problems that felt overwhelming just minutes ago. But looking at this tiny baby, blue-tinged and shivering, she knew she couldn't walk away. "Can you stand?" she asked, already moving to unlock her door. We need to get you both inside and warm. The man nodded weakly and tried to push himself up, but his arms shook with the effort. Imani quickly moved to his other side, careful not to jostle the baby as she helped him to his feet. He was taller than she had realized, probably 6 feet, and despite his current state, she could see the broad shoulders and strong build beneath his expensive clothes. Her apartment was tiny, just a studio with a kitchenette and a bathroom that had seen better days, but it was clean and warm. She guided him to her only chair, a thrift store find she had reupholstered herself, and immediately went to turn up the heat. The man slumped forward, still clutching the baby, and she could see him fighting to stay conscious. "What's your name?" she asked, pulling towels from her bathroom closet. "Nicholas," he said, his voice still rough. "Nicholas Bennett." The name hit her like a punch to the stomach. Nicholas Bennett. She had seen that name in newspapers on billboards around the city. Bennett Industries was one of the largest construction companies in the Southeast, responsible for half the gleaming skyscrapers that were changing Atlanta's skyline. This was a man who could buy and sell her building without thinking twice about it. "Mr. Bennett," she said carefully, draping a towel around his shoulders. "What are you doing here? How did you find my apartment?" He looked up at her with those green eyes, and she saw something that didn't match his reputation as a ruthless businessman. Vulnerability. Complete, raw vulnerability. "I didn't," he said simply. "I was just walking. I've been walking for hours. When the storm started, I saw your building and just..." He trailed off, looking down at the baby in his arms. "I couldn't keep going." Imani knelt in front of him, her nurse training taking over as she checked the baby's breathing and color. The infant was warming up already, the blue tinge fading from her lips. It was definitely a girl, Imani realized, with the finest wisp of dark hair and long eyelashes that rested against plump cheeks. "She's beautiful," Imani said softly. "How old is she?" 5 days. Nicholas's voice cracked on the words. "Her name is Grace." "Where's her mother?" Imani asked gently, though something in Nicholas's expression already told her the answer. "Gone." The single word carried so much pain that Imani had to look away for a moment. "Complications during delivery. The doctors said, they said she might not make it, but I thought..." He stopped, unable to continue. Imani felt her heart break a little. She had seen this before in the hospital, families torn apart by unexpected tragedy, but experiencing it in her own living room felt different. More personal. She reached out and touched his arm gently. "I'm so sorry," she said, meaning every word. I can't imagine how difficult this must be." Nicholas nodded, tears finally spilling over. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "I don't know how to take care of her. I don't know how to do any of this without Rachel." The baby stirred again, making soft sounds that indicated she would be hungry soon. Imani looked around her tiny apartment, calculating what she had that might help. She had some emergency medical supplies from work, and there was a 24-hour pharmacy 2 blocks away, but this man looked like he was about to collapse completely. "When did you last eat?" she asked. Nicholas looked confused by the question, as if the concept of food hadn't occurred to him. I don't remember." "Okay." Imani stood up, her mind shifting into problem-solving mode. "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to sit right there and hold Grace while I make you something to eat. Then we're going to figure out what she needs. Do you have formula? Diapers?" There's a bag," Nicholas said vaguely, gesturing toward the hallway. "I think I dropped it somewhere." Imani went back into the hallway and found an expensive-looking diaper bag that had probably cost more than her monthly food budget. Inside was everything a newborn might need. Formula, bottles, diapers, clothes, all of it looking unused and overwhelming. She brought it back inside and set it on her kitchen counter. "Mr. Bennett," she started. "Nicholas," he corrected softly. "Please." "Nicholas." She sat on the edge of her bed, which was only a few feet away in the small space. "I need you to help me understand what's happening here. You're one of the wealthiest men in Atlanta. You could have any kind of help you want for Grace. Why are you here in my apartment building, in the middle of a storm?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Grace was making more sounds now, and Imani could see that she was working up to a proper cry. Finally, Nicholas looked up at her. "Because I can't face going home," he said simply. "Because everything there reminds me of Rachel. Because I looked at this beautiful baby that we made together, and all I could think was that I was going to fail her the same way I failed her mother." "You didn't fail anyone," Imani said firmly. "Sometimes terrible things happen that are beyond our control." "Are they?" Nicholas asked. "I worked 18-hour days while Rachel was pregnant. I missed appointments. I was in meetings when she went into labor. I was closing a deal when she... He couldn't finish the sentence. Imani understood now. This wasn't just grief. This was guilt, deep and consuming, the kind that could destroy a person if left unchecked. She had seen it in families at the hospital, the way trauma could make people blame themselves for things that were never their fault. Grace's whimpering turned into a real cry, thin and urgent. Nicholas looked panicked, holding her awkwardly like he was afraid she might break. She's hungry, Imani said, getting up to prepare a bottle. It's okay. We can handle this. As she mixed the formula, following the instructions on the container, she found herself making a decision that would change everything. She could call social services. She could call the police. She could insist that Nicholas get professional help and leave her tiny apartment to go back to his mansion and his life of luxury. Instead, she heated the bottle and tested the temperature on her wrist, then sat back down next to Nicholas. Here, she said, adjusting his arms to support Grace properly. Hold her like this. Let her head rest in the crook of your elbow. Nicholas's hands shook as he took the bottle, but Grace latched on immediately, her cries stopping as she drank. The relief on his face was immediate and profound. I've got the night shift covered, Imani lied, knowing she was supposed to be back at work in 10 hours. You both can stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out next steps. Nicholas looked up at her, and for the first time since she had found him in the hallway, something like hope flickered in his green eyes. Why? He asked. Why are you helping us? Imani thought about her overdue rent, her empty refrigerator, her own struggles that seemed so small now in comparison to his. She thought about all the time she had wished someone would show her the same kindness when her world was falling apart. Because everyone deserves help when they need it most, she said simply. And because that little girl needs both of us right now. Imani woke up to the sound of crying and for a moment forgot where she was. The early morning light filtering through her thin curtains illuminated an unfamiliar scene. Nicholas Bennett, still in his expensive but wrinkled suit, pacing her small living space with Grace against his shoulder, looking completely lost. She had given him her bed and taken the couch, though neither of them had slept much. Grace had woken up every 2 hours like clockwork, and each time, Nicholas had looked at Imani with the helpless expression of someone completely out of his depth. Now, at 6 in the morning, it was clear that the baby was not going back to sleep anytime soon. She won't stop, Nicholas said, his voice rough with exhaustion. I fed her, I changed her diaper, but she just keeps crying. Imani stretched, her back protesting from the uncomfortable couch, and went to him. Grace's face was red and scrunched up, her tiny fists waving in the air as she expressed her displeasure with the world. May I? Imani asked, holding out her arms. Nicholas transferred the baby carefully, and immediately, Grace's crying shifted to soft whimpering. Imani began swaying gently, humming a low tune she remembered her grandmother singing years ago. Sometimes they just need movement, she explained softly. And they can sense when we're tense. Babies pick up on everything. Nicholas sank into the chair, running his hands through his dark hair. In the morning light, Imani could see more clearly what grief had done to him. He was probably in his early 30s, with the kind of strong jawline and confident bearing that suggested someone used to being in control. But his eyes were hollow, ringed with dark circles that spoke of more than just one sleepless night. I don't know how people do this, he said quietly. How do people keep tiny humans alive when they barely know what they're doing? The same way everyone learns anything, Imani said, still swaying with Grace, who was finally starting to settle. One day at a time. One feeding at a time. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be present. She looked around her small apartment, taking stock of what they had and what they would need if Nicholas and Grace were going to stay longer than one night. Her refrigerator was nearly empty. She had called in sick to work using one of her precious few sick days, and she still had no idea how she was going to make rent. But looking at this man who had everything money could buy and none of what actually mattered, she couldn't bring herself to regret the decision. Nicholas, she said carefully, I need to ask you something practical. You have family? Friends? People who are probably worried about you right now. He was quiet for a moment, staring at his hands. My assistant, Patricia, she's probably called the police by now. I was supposed to be in meetings yesterday. I just left. And family? My parents died in a car accident when I was 22. Rachel's parents. They blame me for what happened. They're not wrong. Imani felt a pang of sympathy. She had lost her own parents young, her father to a heart attack when she was in high school and her mother to cancer 2 years later. She understood the particular loneliness of facing life's biggest challenges without the safety net of family. They are wrong, she said firmly. Grief makes people look for someone to blame, but that doesn't make it true. Grace had finally fallen asleep in her arms, her tiny face peaceful now. Imani looked down at her and felt something shift in her chest. She had always wanted children, but her marriage to her college boyfriend had ended when they realized they wanted different things from life. Since then, between work and her financial struggles, the idea of family had felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. She's going to need more than what's in that diaper bag if you're planning to take care of her properly, Imani said. And you're going to need clothes that aren't business suits. Nicholas looked down at himself as if just realizing he was still wearing the same clothes from yesterday. I can buy whatever we need. Money isn't. I know money isn't a problem for you, Imani interrupted gently. But shopping for baby supplies isn't the same as closing business deals. And right now, you look like you can barely stand up straight. As if to prove her point, Nicholas swayed slightly in the chair. Imani made a decision. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to put Grace down for her nap, and you're going to shower and get some real sleep. I'll go to the store and get what we need for today. Then tonight we'll make a plan. I can't ask you to do that, Nicholas protested. You've already done so much. You're not asking. I'm offering. Imani moved carefully to place Grace in the makeshift bed she had created using a drawer from her dresser and some soft blankets. Besides, I know what babies need. You don't. Not yet. Nicholas watched her tuck the blankets around Grace with practiced efficiency. You're good at this. Do you have children? The question hit harder than Imani expected. No, she said simply. But I work with families every day at the hospital. You pick things up. She didn't mention the years of trying with her ex-husband, the monthly disappointments, the fertility treatments they couldn't afford that had contributed to the end of their marriage. Some pain was too private to share with a stranger, even one who was trusting her with his most precious thing. The shower is through there, she said, pointing to her tiny bathroom. Towels are in the cabinet. I'll be back in an hour. Nicholas stood up slowly and for a moment they were standing very close in the small space. Imani caught a hint of expensive cologne mixed with baby powder and something else, the distinct scent of grief that seemed to cling to people in crisis. Imani, he said softly, and hearing her name in his voice made something flutter in her chest that she didn't want to examine too closely. Why are you doing this? Really? She thought about the question as she looked at him. Here was a man who probably had people lining up to help him, to get close to his wealth and influence. But those same people would have conditions, expectations, agendas. Maybe what he needed was someone who wanted nothing from him except the chance to do something good. Because yesterday I was walking home in the rain thinking about how alone I was in the world, she said honestly. And then I found you and Grace and I realized maybe none of us have to be alone. Nicholas's eyes widened slightly, and she saw something pass across his face, surprise, maybe, or recognition. Before either of them could say anything else, Grace made a soft sound in her sleep, and they both looked down at her. Get some rest, Imani said softly. She'll be hungry again in about 2 hours. As Nicholas headed toward the bathroom, Imani grabbed her purse and keys, mentally calculating how much she could afford to spend on baby supplies. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. She had made a commitment, and Imani Williams always kept her word. The morning air was clean after the storm, and as she walked toward the pharmacy, she found herself thinking about how much her life had changed in the space of 12 hours. Yesterday, she had been a single woman struggling to make ends meet, focused on her own survival. Today, she was responsible for helping a billionaire learn how to be a father. She thought about Nicholas's question about why she was helping them, and realized she hadn't told him the complete truth. Yes, she understood loneliness, and yes, she believed in helping people. But there was something else, something about the way he looked at Grace with such fierce love mixed with terror that reminded her of every patient's family member she had comforted over the years. Everyone deserved the chance to learn how to love the people who mattered most to them. Even billionaires who had lost their way. What would you do if you found yourself caring for people you barely knew? Would you open your heart and home like Imani? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to see how this unlikely family begins to heal together. When Imani returned from the pharmacy with bags of baby supplies and groceries, she found her apartment transformed into something that looked almost domestic. Nicholas had showered and was now wearing the only casual clothes he had apparently owned, a pair of dark jeans and a white t-shirt that somehow made him look younger and less intimidating. He was sitting cross-legged on her living room floor, Grace lying on a blanket in front of him, and he was talking to her in a soft voice that made Imani pause in the doorway. Your mom would have known exactly what to do with you, he was saying, gently moving Grace's tiny arms in a bicycle motion. She read every book about babies. She had lists and charts and a whole plan for everything. I thought we had all the time in the world to figure it out together. Grace made a soft cooing sound, and Nicholas smiled, the first real smile Imani had seen from him. The transformation was remarkable. He went from looking like a broken man to someone who might just remember how to hope again. How long has she been awake? Imani asked, setting down her bags. Nicholas looked up and she noticed his color was much better after some rest. About 20 minutes. She seems to like lying on the floor. Is that normal? Very normal. Babies need tummy time to develop their muscles. Imani knelt beside them, automatically reaching out to stroke Grace's soft hair. And it looks like she likes hearing your voice. Really? Nicholas looked down at Grace with wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe he was capable of providing comfort to anyone. Really? Babies recognize their parents' voices from the womb. She knows you, Nicholas. She just needs time to adjust to the world outside. Imani began unpacking the supplies she had bought. More formula, diapers, a few basic clothes in newborn and 0-3-month sizes, some receiving blankets and bottles. She had also splurged on a small bouncy seat that would give them somewhere safe to put Grace when they both needed their hands free. How much do I owe you for all this? Nicholas asked, reaching for his wallet. We'll figure that out later, Imani said, waving him off. She had spent nearly $80, which represented a significant chunk of her remaining money, but she couldn't bring herself to take cash from him while he was sitting on her floor in borrowed vulnerability. Right now, let's focus on getting Grace fed and happy. As if summoned by the mention of food, Grace began making the small sounds that indicated hunger was approaching. Imani showed Nicholas how to prepare the bottle properly, testing the temperature and checking the flow of the nipple. The trick is to let her set the pace, Imani explained as Nicholas settled into the chair with Grace. If she pulls away, give her a break. If she pushes the bottle away with her tongue, she's probably done. Nicholas followed her instructions carefully, his full attention focused on the tiny person in his arms. Grace drank eagerly, her small hand resting against the bottle, and Imani found herself watching both of them with a strange warmth in her chest. You're getting the hang of this, she said softly. It doesn't feel like it, Nicholas replied, but there was less panic in his voice than there had been the night before. I keep waiting for someone to tell me I'm doing it wrong. The only one who can tell you that is Grace herself, and she seems pretty content right now. When Grace finished eating, Nicholas looked up at Imani expectantly. What now? Now she probably needs to be burped, and then she might want to play for a little while before her next nap. Play? Nicholas looked skeptical. She's 5 days old. Babies are born ready to learn, Imani said, settling beside them on the floor. Talk to her. Make faces. Let her look at different things. She's taking in everything right now. For the next hour, Imani watched Nicholas discover fatherhood in her tiny living room. He talked to Grace about the construction projects his company was working on, describing the new hospital they were building in ridiculous detail until Grace fell asleep to the sound of his voice explaining structural engineering concepts. I think you just put her to sleep with talk about foundation supports, Imani said, trying not to laugh. Is that bad? Nicholas looked concerned. It's perfect. Whatever works. As Grace slept in her makeshift bed, Imani made lunch from the grocery she had bought, nothing fancy, just sandwiches and soup, but Nicholas ate like he hadn't seen food in days. He probably hadn't, she realized. Grief had a way of making people forget basic human needs. Imani, he said as they ate, I need to ask you something and I want you to be honest with me. She nodded, waiting. How long can I stay here? I know this isn't a permanent solution, but I can't. I'm not ready to go back to my life yet. My house, my work, all of it feels impossible right now. Imani thought about her overdue rent, about the calls from Mr. Rodriguez that she was still avoiding, about the fact that she had already used a sick day she couldn't afford to lose. Then she looked at Grace, sleeping peacefully in her drawer bed, and at Nicholas, who was finally starting to look like he might survive this. My lease says no overnight guests for more than a week, she said carefully, but Mr. Rodriguez is pretty understanding. The real question is what's best for Grace. She needs stability, routine, a safe place to grow. She has that here, Nicholas said immediately. With you. You're better at this than I am. Nicholas. Imani set down her soup spoon and looked at him directly. I'm not Grace's parent. You are. I can help you learn, but she needs you to step up and be her father. Something passed across his face, fear, maybe, or uncertainty. What if I can't? Then you learn. The same way every new parent learns. Imani reached across her small table and touched his hand briefly. But I don't think you're giving yourself enough credit. You haven't left her side since yesterday. You're already stepping up. They were interrupted by Grace stirring, making the soft sounds that meant she was waking up. Nicholas immediately got up to check on her, and Imani watched as he gently picked her up, his movements already more confident than they had been that morning. "Hey there, beautiful girl," he said softly. "Ready to learn more about load-bearing walls?" Imani laughed, a real laugh that surprised both of them. Maybe we should introduce her to some other topics too. Music maybe. Stories. I don't know any stories, Nicholas said, but he was smiling slightly. Everyone knows stories. What did your parents read to you when you were little? Nicholas's expression grew thoughtful. My mom used to read me this book about a little engine that could. I haven't thought about that in years. There you go. Grace would love to hear about the little engine. As if she agreed, Grace made a happy gurgling sound that made both adults smile. Outside, Imani could hear the sounds of her neighborhood children playing, music from someone's radio, the normal rhythm of life continuing around them. But inside her small apartment, it felt like they had created their own small world where time moved differently and the only things that mattered were feeding schedules and diaper changes and the miracle of a tiny person learning to exist in the world. I should call Patricia, Nicholas said eventually. My assistant. Let her know I'm alive. That's probably a good idea. People care about you, Nicholas. They're probably worried. He nodded, pulling out his phone, which had been turned off since yesterday. When he powered it on, it immediately began buzzing with missed calls and text messages. 37 missed calls, he said, looking overwhelmed. Start with Patricia, Imani suggested. Tell her you're safe but you need some time. You don't have to explain everything right now. Nicholas stepped into the bathroom for privacy while he made the call, and Imani found herself alone with Grace for the first time since they had arrived. She picked up the baby, marveling at how light she was, how perfect her tiny features were. Your daddy is learning, she whispered to Grace. He's going to be good at this, I think. He just needs to believe in himself. Grace's dark eyes seemed to focus on Imani's face, and for a moment, it felt like the baby was really seeing her, really present. It was the kind of moment that made people fall in love with babies, that made all the sleepless nights and constant worry worth it. When Nicholas came back, he looked both relieved and anxious. Patricia is going to handle my meetings for the rest of the week, he said. She didn't ask questions, which I appreciate. But Imani, I can't stay here indefinitely. It's not fair to you. We'll figure it out, Imani said, though she wasn't sure how. One day at a time, remember? Nicholas nodded, then looked around her small apartment as if seeing it clearly for the first time. This place is wonderful, he said quietly. It feels like a home. Imani followed his gaze, trying to see her space through his eyes. The second-hand furniture she had painted and reupholstered, the plants she kept on the windowsill, the photographs of her parents and friends that covered one wall like a collage of love and memory. It wasn't much, but it was hers. It's small, she said. Small can be perfect, Nicholas replied, and something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. He was watching Grace in her arms with an expression she couldn't quite read, but it looked something like peace. Maybe, Imani thought, they really could figure this out one day at a time. The peace of their small world was shattered at 10 o'clock the next morning when someone began pounding on Imani's door with the kind of authority that demanded immediate attention. Grace had been having a fussy morning, and both Imani and Nicholas were exhausted from taking turns walking her around the tiny apartment. The sudden loud knocking made Grace start crying again, and Nicholas looked like he might panic. Let me get it, Imani said, handing Grace to Nicholas and moving toward the door. She looked through the peephole and saw a woman in her 50s wearing an expensive business suit and carrying a briefcase, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that suggested someone who did not appreciate being kept waiting. Nicholas Bennett, I know you're in there, the woman called through the door. Patricia Rodriguez from Bennett Industries. We need to talk immediately. Nicholas went pale. That's my assistant. I told her I needed time. Apparently she decided you've had enough, Imani said, opening the door just enough to speak to the woman. Ms. Rodriguez, I presume? Patricia looked Imani up and down with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, taking in her nurse scrubs, her modest apartment behind her, and probably calculating exactly how much money Imani didn't have within seconds. And you are? Patricia asked crisply. Imani Williams. I'm helping Mr. Bennett with his daughter. I see. Patricia's tone suggested she saw quite a lot and didn't approve of most of it. I need to speak with Nicholas immediately. There's a corporate crisis that requires his attention. From behind Imani, Nicholas appeared with Grace still crying in his arms, looking like he hadn't slept in days, which wasn't far from the truth. "Patricia," he said wearily, "I told you I needed time." "Time you don't have," Patricia replied briskly, pushing past Imani into the small apartment. Her eyes swept the space, taking in the makeshift baby bed, the formula supplies on the counter, and the general chaos of new parenthood. "The Henderson project is falling apart. They're threatening to pull out, which would cost us $12 million. The board is asking questions about your absence, and there are rumors circulating that you've had some kind of breakdown." Nicholas closed his eyes briefly, still bouncing Grace gently. "Let them pull out. Let the board ask questions." "Nicholas." Patricia's voice took on the tone of someone speaking to a particularly stubborn child. "You have responsibilities. People are depending on you. This company doesn't run itself." "Right now, my only responsibility is this baby," Nicholas said, his voice firmer than Imani had heard it since she found him in her hallway. "Everything else can wait." Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but then she really looked at Nicholas for the first time. Imani watched the older woman's expression change as she took in his appearance, the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he held Grace like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to the world. "Nicholas," Patricia said more gently, "what happened to you? You disappeared from the office 3 days ago without a word. When I finally tracked down where you might be, I never expected to find you here." Imani felt the slight emphasis on the last word and bristled. There was nothing wrong with her apartment, nothing wrong with her neighborhood, nothing wrong with her life that warranted that tone. "He's exactly where he needs to be," Imani said firmly. "He's learning to take care of his daughter." Patricia turned those sharp blue eyes on her again. "And you are qualified to teach him how exactly? Are you a nanny? A child care professional?" "I'm a registered nurse," Imani replied, keeping her voice level despite the condescension. "I work in cardiac intensive care at Mercy General. I think I can handle basic infant care." "I'm sure you're very capable," Patricia said in a tone that suggested the opposite, "but Nicholas doesn't need a nurse. He needs to come home, hire proper help, and get back to running his company." "What I need," Nicholas said, his voice cutting through the tension, "is for everyone to stop talking about me like I'm not in the room. Patricia, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not coming back yet." "The Henderson meeting is tomorrow morning," Patricia pressed. "If you're not there, they walk. $12 million, Nicholas. And 300 jobs. Imani saw Nicholas flinch at the mention of the jobs. She was beginning to understand that beneath his grief and confusion, he was still a man who took his responsibilities seriously. The weight of other people's livelihoods was something he couldn't easily dismiss. Grace's crying had escalated to the full-throated wails that newborns could produce when they were truly unhappy. Nicholas looked overwhelmed, trying to comfort her while dealing with Patricia's demands. "Here," Imani said, reaching for Grace. "Let me." She took the baby and immediately began the swaying motion that had worked before, humming softly. Grace's cries began to subside, and within minutes she was calm again, her tiny hand gripping Imani's finger. Patricia watched this exchange with calculating eyes. "Nicholas," she said slowly, "perhaps we could reach a compromise." Nicholas looked wary. "What kind of compromise?" "The Henderson meeting is crucial, but it's also just one meeting. What if Ms. Williams accompanied you? She could care for Grace while you handled the business." Imani started to protest. She had to work, she had her own responsibilities, but Nicholas was already shaking his head. "I'm not dragging Grace into a corporate boardroom. She needs stability, quiet, a safe environment. My office has a private suite adjacent to the main conference room," Patricia said. "It's completely soundproof, comfortable, equipped with everything an infant might need. Ms. Williams could stay there with Grace while you conduct the meeting." "I don't know," Nicholas said, looking at Imani. "What do you think?" Imani found herself caught between competing impulses. Part of her wanted to tell Patricia exactly what she thought of her assumptions and her condescending attitude. But another part of her recognized that Nicholas needed to start building a bridge back to his life, even if he wasn't ready to cross it completely. "How long would this meeting last?" she asked. 2 hours at most," Patricia said quickly, sensing an opportunity. "And of course, we would compensate Ms. Williams appropriately for her time." "This isn't about money," Imani said firmly, though the truth was she desperately needed money. "This is about what's best for Grace and Nicholas." Nicholas looked down at his daughter, now peaceful in Imani's arms, then back at Patricia. "If I do this, it's just one meeting. I'm not ready to come back full-time." "One meeting," Patricia agreed. "But Nicholas, you should know, there are other pressures building. The board is concerned. If you continue to be absent without explanation, they might start questioning your fitness to lead the company. The threat was clear, and Imani saw Nicholas's jaw tighten. This was his life's work, the company he had built from the ground up after inheriting a small construction business from his parents. Losing it would be another devastating blow he wasn't prepared to handle. They wouldn't dare, he said quietly. They would if they thought it was in the best interests of the company and the shareholders, Patricia replied matter-of-factly. I'm not saying I agree with them, but I am saying you need to be strategic about how you handle this situation. Imani felt a surge of anger on Nicholas's behalf. Here was a man who had just lost his wife and was trying to learn how to be a father, and instead of support he was getting ultimatums and threats. Maybe, she said carefully, it would be good for you to show your face. Let people see that you're still capable, still in control. Nicholas looked at her with surprise. You think I should go? I think you should do whatever feels right for you and Grace. But I also think Patricia might be right about this one meeting. Sometimes you have to play the game to protect what matters most. They were all quiet for a moment, the only sound Grace's soft breathing. Finally Nicholas nodded. One meeting, he said to Patricia. But I want to see this private suite first. If it's not appropriate for Grace, the deal is off. Of course, Patricia said, looking relieved. We can go this afternoon so you can inspect the facilities. After Patricia left, promising to send a car for them later, Nicholas slumped into the chair and put his head in his hands. I don't know if I can do this, he said. I don't know if I can sit in a room and pretend to care about construction contracts when all I want to do is hold my daughter and make sure she's safe. You don't have to pretend anything, Imani said, settling beside him with grace. You just have to show up and be yourself. The part of you that cares about those 300 jobs, that built this company, that takes responsibility seriously, that's still who you are. Is it? Nicholas looked up at her. Because right now I feel like I don't know who I am at all. That's normal, Imani said gently. Grief changes us. Becoming a parent changes us. You're not the same person you were a week ago, and that's okay. But the core of who you are, the things that make you fundamentally Nicholas, those haven't disappeared. Nicholas reached out and touched Grace's tiny hand where it rested against Imani's arm. What if I can't protect her from all of this? The corporate world, the pressure, the expectations. You don't have to protect her from everything, Imani said. You just have to love her and make sure she knows she's the most important thing in your world. Everything else is just details. Nicholas was quiet for a long moment, watching Grace sleep. Will you really come with me tomorrow? To the meeting? If you want me to, yes. I do. He looked up at her with those green eyes that seemed to see more than they should. I don't think I can do this without you, Imani. And that scares me. It scared her too, but for different reasons. She was getting attached to both of them, to the idea of being needed, of being part of something that felt like family. But she also knew that this situation was temporary, that eventually Nicholas would return to his world and she would go back to hers. One step at a time, she said, as much to herself as to him. Tomorrow we'll take care of one meeting. After that, we'll figure out what comes next. Nicholas nodded, then surprised her by reaching over and taking her free hand in his. Thank you, he said simply. For everything. Imani squeezed his hand briefly before pulling away, telling herself that the warmth she felt was just satisfaction at helping someone in need. But as she looked down at Grace and then back at Nicholas, she knew she was lying to herself. She was falling for both of them, and that was a complication none of them could afford. The Bennett Industries headquarters occupied 15 floors of a gleaming downtown Atlanta tower, all glass and steel that caught the late afternoon sun like a beacon of corporate success. As their car pulled up to the executive entrance, Imani felt decidedly out of place in her best dress, a simple navy blue number she usually saved for church while carrying Grace in the infant car seat they had borrowed from the hospital's family lounge. Nicholas, back in his element wearing an expensive charcoal suit, looked like a different person from the broken man she had found in her hallway. But Imani could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand kept moving to check on Grace even though she was right there beside him. You don't have to do this, she said quietly as they rode the elevator to the executive floor. Yes, I do, Nicholas replied, but his voice was steady. You were right yesterday. Sometimes you have to play the game to protect what matters most. The elevator opened into a reception area that screamed expensive taste: marble floors, original artwork on the walls, and furniture that probably cost more than Imani's annual salary. Patricia was waiting for them, looking perfectly composed in her business armor. Nicholas, good. The Henderson team arrived early. They're in conference room A. She glanced at Grace, who was sleeping peacefully in her carrier. The private suite is this way. Patricia led them down a hallway lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a spectacular view of the Atlanta skyline. The private suite turned out to be larger than Imani's entire apartment, with a comfortable seating area, a small kitchenette, and even a separate room with a daybed. There's a baby monitor system that connects to the conference room, Patricia explained, showing them a small device on the coffee table. You'll be able to hear if Nicholas needs anything, and he'll know immediately if Grace requires his attention. Imani had to admit it was impressive. The room was quiet, comfortable, and well-equipped. Grace would be safe here, and Imani could care for her without worrying about disrupting the important business meeting. How do I look? Nicholas asked, adjusting his tie with hands that shook slightly. Like the CEO of a major corporation, Imani said honestly. Grace would be proud of her daddy. Something in his expression softened at her words. I'll try to make this quick. Take as long as you need. We'll be right here. After Nicholas left with Patricia, Imani settled into the comfortable chair and looked around the suite. This was Nicholas's world, expensive, powerful, intimidating. She thought about her own life, her tiny apartment, her struggles to make ends meet, and wondered what she was doing here. Grace stirred in her carrier, making soft sounds that indicated she would be hungry soon. Imani prepared a bottle using the supplies they had brought, marveling at the contrast between mixing formula in this executive suite versus her cramped kitchen at home. Through the baby monitor, she could hear voices as the meeting began. Nicholas's voice was clear and confident as he greeted the Henderson team, apologizing for his recent absence due to a family emergency without going into details. Imani found herself listening intently, curious about this side of him she hadn't seen. The Henderson project represents more than just another construction contract, Nicholas was saying. It's an opportunity to revitalize that entire neighborhood, to create jobs and housing that will serve the community for generations. There was passion in his voice when he talked about his work, the same kind of dedication Imani felt when she talked about nursing. She began to understand that this wasn't just about money for him. He genuinely cared about the impact his company had on people's lives. Grace finished her bottle and seemed content to lie in her carrier, looking around the unfamiliar space with the alert curiosity of a healthy newborn. Imani found herself talking to the baby, describing what they could see through the windows, making silly faces that earned her some adorable baby expressions in return. Your daddy is in there being very important, she told Grace softly. He's making sure people have jobs and homes. That's pretty special, isn't it? The meeting continued for over an hour, and Imani could hear the tension in the room as negotiations grew more complex. There were mentions of budget overruns, timeline concerns, and regulatory hurdles that made her grateful she worked in healthcare instead of business. Then something changed. Nicholas's voice became more personal, more vulnerable than she had heard it in a professional setting. I want to be honest with you, he was saying. The past week has been the most difficult of my life. I lost my wife recently, and I'm learning how to be a father to a newborn daughter. It's changed my perspective on a lot of things, including what this company means to me and what kind of legacy I want to build. There was silence on the monitor, and Imani held her breath, wondering if this personal revelation would help or hurt his position. The Henderson project isn't just about profit margins, Nicholas continued. It's about creating something that will still matter when my daughter is grown up, something she can be proud of. I want to build communities, not just buildings. And I believe that vision aligns with what Henderson Construction has always stood for. One of the Henderson representatives spoke up, his voice warmer than it had been earlier. Nicholas, we had no idea about your personal situation. Our condolences on your loss. Thank you. And I want you to know that my commitment to this project hasn't wavered. If anything, it's stronger now. I have someone I need to build a better world for. Grace made a soft cooing sound as if she approved of her father's words, and Imani felt her heart squeeze with an emotion she didn't want to name. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, but the tone had shifted completely. By the time it ended, not only had the Henderson team agreed to continue with the project, they had also expressed interest in expanding their partnership with Bennett Industries. When Nicholas returned to the suite, his face was flushed with success and something that looked like relief. How did it go? Imani asked, though she had heard most of it through the monitor. Better than I hoped. They're staying with the project and... He paused, looking down at Grace with wonder. I think I remembered who I am in there. Not just as a businessman but as someone who wants to make a difference. You were amazing, Imani said, meaning every word. The way you talked about building communities, about doing this for Grace. That was real leadership. Nicholas sat down beside her, reaching out to stroke Grace's cheek gently. I couldn't have done it without knowing you were both here. Having you close by, knowing Grace was safe and happy, it made everything else possible. There was something in his tone that made Imani look at him more carefully. His eyes were softer than she had seen them, focused entirely on her face in a way that made her heart race. Nicholas, she started, but he interrupted her gently. I know this situation is complicated, he said quietly. I know you have your own life, your own responsibilities. But I need you to know that these past few days, they've meant everything to me. You've saved us both. Imani felt tears prick her eyes. You would have figured it out on your own. Maybe. But it would have taken much longer and it wouldn't have felt like this. He gestured around the suite, but somehow she knew he meant something bigger than just the room. It wouldn't have felt like hope. Before either of them could say anything else, Patricia appeared in the doorway looking pleased with herself. The Henderson meeting was a complete success, she announced. They're not only staying with the project, they want to discuss 3 additional contracts. Nicholas, the board will be thrilled. Good, Nicholas said, but his attention was still on Grace and Imani. Patricia, I need to ask you something. How flexible is the company about remote work arrangements? Patricia looked confused. For executives? We've never really. I'm not ready to come back full-time yet, Nicholas said firmly. I need more time with Grace, but I also can't completely abandon my responsibilities. Could we set up a system where I handle the most important meetings and decisions, but work from a more flexible location? Imani's heart jumped. Was he talking about staying at her apartment longer? I suppose we could arrange something temporary, Patricia said carefully. But Nicholas, long-term, you need to consider more permanent childcare arrangements. A nanny, perhaps, someone who could care for Grace while you work normal hours. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Nicholas said, standing up with Grace's carrier. Right now, I just want to go home. As they left the gleaming corporate tower, Imani realized that when Nicholas said home, he was talking about her small apartment. The thought should have overwhelmed her, but instead, it filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the late afternoon sun. They were becoming something she didn't have a name for yet, not quite a family, but more than just strangers helping each other through a crisis. And despite all the logical reasons why this couldn't last, Imani found herself hoping it wouldn't end anytime soon. In the car on the way back to her neighborhood, Grace fell asleep to the gentle motion, and Nicholas surprised Imani by taking her hand. Thank you, he said simply. For today, for everything. Imani squeezed his hand, allowing herself to enjoy the moment of connection. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make about how long this arrangement could continue. But tonight they were going home together and that was enough. 3 days later, Imani woke up on her couch to find Nicholas already awake, sitting in the chair with Grace against his shoulder, both of them silhouetted against the early morning light filtering through her thin curtains. He was humming something soft and low, and Grace was making the contented sounds that meant she had been fed and was now enjoying the simple pleasure of being close to someone who loved her. The sight made Imani's chest tight with an emotion she was still trying not to examine too closely. This was what mornings looked like now in her small apartment, not the solitary routine of coffee and rushing to get ready for work, but the gentle rhythm of shared responsibility and quiet moments that felt like family. Good morning, she said softly, not wanting to disturb the peaceful scene. Nicholas looked over at her with a smile that was becoming more natural each day. Good morning. She slept for almost 4 hours straight. I think she's finally getting the hang of this sleeping thing. That's wonderful. Pretty soon you'll both be getting full nights of sleep again. Imani stretched and stood up, automatically moving toward the kitchen to start coffee. It had become their routine. Nicholas handled early morning Grace duty while Imani prepared breakfast. Then they would switch off so she could get ready for work while he took care of the baby. Except today was Saturday, which meant Imani didn't have to rush off to the hospital. They had a whole day together, something that had become precious to all 3 of them. I've been thinking, Nicholas said as she measured coffee grounds, about what Patricia said the other day. About permanent arrangements. Imani's hand stilled on the coffee pot. They had been avoiding this conversation for days, but she knew it was inevitable. This arrangement, as wonderful as it had become, was temporary. Nicholas couldn't live in her studio apartment forever, and she couldn't continue putting her life on hold indefinitely. What kind of thinking? She asked carefully. I called a real estate agent yesterday while you were at work. Asked her to start looking for houses. Imani felt something drop in her stomach, though she couldn't say why. Of course Nicholas would want his own place again eventually. Of course he would want to give Grace a proper home, not a makeshift nursery in someone else's living room. That makes sense, she said, proud of how level her voice sounded. Grace needs more space as she grows. The thing is, Nicholas continued, adjusting Grace slightly as she dozed against his shoulder, I don't want just any house. I want something that feels like this. Like what? Like a home. Like family. Like the way mornings feel here with you. Imani's hand trembled as she poured water into the coffee maker. Nicholas. I know what you're going to say, he said quickly. That this is complicated, that we've only known each other a week, that I'm still grieving and not thinking clearly. And maybe you're right about some of that. But I also know that I've never felt as safe anywhere as I do in this apartment with you and Grace. The coffee maker began its familiar gurgling, filling the silence between them. Imani leaned against the counter, trying to sort through the tangle of her own feelings. It's not that simple, she said finally. Why not? Imani looked at him sitting there with his daughter, looking like he belonged in her life, and felt her heart break a little. Because she wanted it to be simple. She wanted to believe that love could bridge the gap between their different worlds, their different circumstances. But she had learned the hard way that wanting something wasn't enough. Because we're from completely different worlds, she said softly. Because you're worth millions of dollars and I can barely make rent. Because when you're feeling better, when the grief isn't so overwhelming, you're going to realize that you don't need me anymore. Nicholas was quiet for so long that Imani thought she might have hurt his feelings. When he finally spoke, his voice was very gentle. Is that what happened before? With your marriage? Imani's breath caught. They hadn't talked about her past, about why she was alone, about the dreams that had failed to materialize in her own life. How did you? You get this look sometimes when you're holding Grace, Nicholas said. Like you're remembering something that hurts. And yesterday when Patricia mentioned finding a nanny, you went very quiet. I've been wondering if there's something you're not telling me. Imani poured coffee for both of them, using the familiar ritual to buy herself time. She hadn't talked about her marriage to anyone in months, hadn't shared the full story of how her dreams of family had slowly crumbled under the weight of medical bills and failed treatments and two people who wanted different things from life. His name was Jerome, she said finally, settling into the chair across from Nicholas. We met in college, got married right after graduation. He was going to be a teacher, I was going to be a nurse, and we were going to have a house full of children and be happy. Grace stirred slightly in Nicholas's arms, and he began swaying gently, his attention focused on Imani's face. What happened? We tried for 3 years to have a baby. 3 years of tests and treatments and monthly disappointments. The fertility treatments we couldn't really afford put us into debt, and the stress of it all, it changed us. Changed how we related to each other. Imani took a sip of coffee, remembering the gradual erosion of hope, the way conversations about the future became arguments about money and blame and whether to keep trying. Jerome wanted to stop the treatments, maybe consider adoption later when we were more financially stable. But I couldn't let go of the idea of having our own biological child. I became obsessed with it, convinced that if we just tried one more time, spent a little more money, found the right doctor. That's understandable, Nicholas said quietly. Wanting children is natural. Is it? Or was I just being selfish, forcing my dreams onto someone who had already given up? Imani shook her head. Either way, it broke us. Jerome said I loved the idea of a baby more than I loved him, and maybe he was right. By the end, all we could talk about was what we didn't have instead of what we did. I'm sorry, Nicholas said, and she could hear the genuine sympathy in his voice. That must have been incredibly painful. The divorce was finalized 2 years ago. Jerome remarried last year, and his new wife is pregnant with their first child. Imani laughed, but there was no humor in it. Turns out the problem wasn't him after all. Imani. Nicholas leaned forward, Grace still sleeping peacefully in his arms. You know that's not how fertility works, right? It's not about blame or fault. Sometimes these things just happen. Logically, yes. Emotionally, she shrugged. It's hard not to feel broken when your body won't do the one thing you want most in the world. They sat in silence for a moment, Grace's soft breathing the only sound in the small apartment. Finally, Nicholas spoke again. Is that why you've been so good with Grace? Because you've always wanted children? Maybe, Imani admitted. Or maybe it's because taking care of her feels like the closest I'm ever going to get to being a mother. What if it didn't have to be? Imani looked up at him sharply. Nicholas, what are you saying? I'm saying that Grace already thinks of you as family. I'm saying that I can't imagine raising her without you. I'm saying that maybe we've both been given a second chance at the things we thought we lost. Imani's heart was racing, but she forced herself to think logically. You're still grieving Rachel. You're overwhelmed and scared and looking for stability wherever you can find it. What happens when that changes? What happens when you meet someone else, someone from your world who can give you everything I can't? Like what? Like a woman who can have your children. Like someone who fits into your life without needing charity or rescue or whatever this is. Nicholas was quiet for a long moment, and Imani wondered if she had pushed too hard, said too much truth too quickly. Imani, he said finally, look at me. She met his eyes reluctantly. I'm not trying to rescue you and I'm not offering you charity. I'm telling you that in the space of 1 week, you've become one of the most important people in my life. You've shown me what it means to put family first, what it looks like to love someone unconditionally. Grace lights up when she sees you. I light up when I see you. But what if? What if 100 different things? Nicholas interrupted gently. What if I get hit by a bus tomorrow? What if you decide you don't want this? What if Grace grows up and hates us both? We can't live our lives based on what might go wrong. Grace chose that moment to wake up, making soft sounds and opening her dark eyes to look around the apartment that had become her first home. When she saw Imani, she made a happy gurgling sound that went straight to Imani's heart. See, Nicholas said softly. She knows who her family is. Imani reached out to take Grace, and the baby settled against her immediately, comfortable and trusting. Looking down at this perfect little person, then up at Nicholas, Imani felt something shift inside her chest. Maybe he was right. Maybe they couldn't base their decisions on fear of what might happen. Maybe sometimes you had to take a leap of faith and trust that love would be enough to catch you. So what are you proposing exactly? She asked. Nicholas smiled, the first completely unguarded smile she had seen from him since the day she found him in her hallway. I'm proposing that we stop thinking of this as temporary, he said. I'm proposing that we find a house together, raise Grace together, build something real together. I'm proposing that we stop being afraid of what this could become and start being excited about it instead. Imani looked down at Grace, then around her small apartment that had somehow become home to all three of them, then back at Nicholas. He was offering her everything she had ever wanted: family, love, security, a future. It terrified her and thrilled her in equal measure. One condition, she said finally. Anything. I keep my job. I keep my independence. I don't want to be someone who exists only in relation to you and Grace. I need to be myself too. Of course, Nicholas said immediately. I wouldn't want you to be anyone else. Grace made another happy sound as if she approved of their negotiation, and despite all her fears and uncertainties, Imani found herself smiling. Okay, she said softly. Let's see what happens. Nicholas's smile could have powered the entire building. Yeah. Let's be a family. The house Nicholas's real estate agent showed them the following Tuesday was everything Imani had never dared to dream of. Set on 2 acres in an established neighborhood of Buckhead, it featured 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a gourmet kitchen that could have been featured in a magazine, and enough space for Grace to grow up surrounded by beauty and comfort. It also cost more than Imani would make in 10 years. The previous owners completely renovated in 2018, the agent, a perfectly polished woman named Rebecca, explained as they toured the spacious master suite. All new fixtures, hardwood floors throughout, and the nursery adjacent to the master bedroom was designed with families in mind. Nicholas was holding Grace, pointing out features to her as if a week-old baby could appreciate crown molding and walk-in closets. But Imani could see the excitement in his eyes as he envisioned their life here: Grace taking her first steps across these gleaming floors, family dinners in the formal dining room, quiet evenings in the library that had built-in bookshelves from floor to ceiling. What do you think? He asked Imani as they stood in the nursery, afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked a garden that looked like something from a fairy tale. It's beautiful, Imani said honestly. And it was also completely overwhelming. I can see Grace here, Nicholas said softly, walking to the windows with the baby. I can see us here. Rebecca, sensing a potential sale, launched into details about the neighborhood schools, the proximity to parks and cultural attractions, the property values that had been steadily increasing for the past decade. With every word, Imani felt herself shrinking a little more. This wasn't just a house. This was a statement about the kind of life Nicholas wanted to build, the kind of family he envisioned. And while it included her in theory, she couldn't shake the feeling that she would always be a guest in a world that belonged to him and Grace. After Rebecca left them to discuss the property privately, Nicholas and Imani sat in the living room while Grace napped in her carrier. The silence felt heavier than usual. You don't like it, Nicholas said finally. I like it, Imani said carefully. It's gorgeous. Grace would have everything she could ever need here. But Imani looked around the perfect room with its perfect furniture and perfect view. But I keep thinking about how I would fit into all this. My furniture wouldn't work here. My life wouldn't work here. I'd feel like I was playing house instead of actually living. Nicholas reached over and took her hand. We would make it our home. Together. Would we? Or would it be your home that you graciously share with me? Nicholas was quiet for a moment, and Imani could see him processing her words. Is that how you think I see you? As someone I'm being gracious to? I don't know how you see me, Imani said honestly. Sometimes I think you see me as Grace's caregiver, sometimes as someone who saved you when you needed it most, sometimes as something else. But I'm never sure which is real. All of it is real, Nicholas said immediately. You're Grace's caregiver and my savior and the woman I'm falling in love with, all at the same time. Imani's breath caught at his words. They had been dancing around their feelings for days, but hearing him say it out loud made everything more real and more complicated. Nicholas. I know it's fast, he continued. I know the circumstances are unusual. But I also know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You make me want to be a better father, a better man. You make everything feel possible. Grace stirred in her carrier, making soft sounds that indicated she was waking up. Imani leaned forward to check on her, using the moment to compose herself. What if we approach this differently? Nicholas said suddenly. What do you mean? What if, instead of us moving into my house or your apartment, we created something new together? What if you let me make you an offer that takes care of both of our needs? Imani looked at him warily. What kind of offer? Nicholas took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice had the careful tone of someone making a business proposal. I want you to be Grace's nanny. Officially. I want to pay you a salary that would allow you to quit your job at the hospital if you wanted to, or reduce your hours significantly. I want to provide health insurance, housing, everything you need to focus on what matters most. Imani stared at him. You want to hire me? I want to take care of you the way you've taken care of us, Nicholas said earnestly. I want to make sure you never have to worry about rent or bills or any of the things that have been making your life difficult. I want to give you the security to make choices based on what you want, not what you can afford. And in exchange? In exchange, you help me raise Grace. You be the mother she needs, the partner I need. You let me love you both without worrying about whether you're going to disappear when things get difficult. Imani felt her heart racing. Part of her was tempted the security he was offering would solve every financial worry she had. But another part of her was insulted by the clinical way he was presenting it. So I would be your employee, she said slowly. No, Nicholas said quickly. You would be family. The salary would just be a way to make sure you're taken care of. Nicholas, do you understand how that sounds? You're basically offering to pay me to be your girlfriend. Nicholas looked stricken. That's not. I didn't mean it that way. Grace was fully awake now, looking around with the alert curiosity that meant she was happy and comfortable. Imani picked her up, needing something to do with her hands while she processed Nicholas's proposal. I think, she said carefully, that we need to separate two different conversations. There's the conversation about us about whether we have a future together as whatever we are. And there's the conversation about Grace and what's best for her. They're not separate, Nicholas protested. You're part of both conversations. Are they? Or are you trying to solve your childcare problem and your loneliness at the same time by paying me to stick around? The words came out harsher than Imani had intended, but she was feeling cornered by the weight of his offer and everything it implied. Nicholas looked like she had slapped him. Is that really what you think of me? He asked quietly. Imani looked down at Grace, who was watching her with those serious dark eyes that seemed to see everything. I think you're a good man who's been through something terrible and is trying to build a life for his daughter. I think you're grateful to me for helping when you needed it most. But I don't know if what you're feeling is love or just relief that someone stepped up when you couldn't. And what are you feeling? Nicholas asked. It was a fair question and one Imani had been avoiding answering even to herself. She looked at him sitting there in this perfect house, offering her a perfect life, and tried to sort through the tangle of emotions in her chest. I'm feeling scared, she said honestly. Scared that I'm falling in love with both of you. Scared that this is all going to disappear when you don't need rescuing anymore. Scared that I'm going to lose myself in trying to be what you need me to be. Nicholas stood up and moved closer to her, his voice gentle. What would it take for you to trust that this is real? That what I feel for you has nothing to do with gratitude or convenience. Imani thought about it, still holding Grace, who had grown quiet as if she was listening to every word. Time, she said finally. And space to figure out who we are when we're not in crisis mode. And the chance to build something together instead of you just providing everything for me? Okay, Nicholas said immediately. What would that look like? I don't know yet. But maybe we start smaller. Maybe we find a place that we can afford together with my salary and whatever arrangement we work out. Maybe I keep working part-time at the hospital because I love my job and I'm good at it. Maybe we figure out how to be partners instead of whatever this offer would make us. Nicholas was quiet for a long moment, and Imani could see him struggling with the idea of not being able to simply solve their problems with money. You're right, he said finally. I'm trying to control the situation by throwing money at it, aren't I? A little bit, yes. It's what I do, Nicholas admitted. When there's a problem, I figure out the most efficient solution and implement it. But relationships don't work that way. No, they don't. Grace made a soft sound and reached up toward Imani's face with her tiny hand. Imani caught the little fingers and kissed them gently. She's going to need both of us, Imani said softly. Not because you're paying me to be here, but because we both love her and want what's best for her. And what about us? Nicholas asked. What do we need? Imani looked up at him, this complicated man who had turned her life upside down in the space of a week, and felt her resolve waver. He was offering her security, love, family, everything she had ever wanted. Why was she making it so difficult? Because she had learned the hard way that relationships built on need rather than choice rarely lasted. Because she had to know that he wanted her for who she was, not just for what she could do for him and Grace. We need to take this slower, she said. We need to date each other properly, figure out if we actually like each other when we're not in survival mode. We need to make sure that what we're feeling is love and not just gratitude and proximity. Nicholas smiled slightly. So you're turning down my job offer? I'm turning down your job offer, Imani confirmed. But I'm not turning down this. Whatever this is. What are you proposing instead? Imani took a deep breath, feeling like she was stepping off a cliff. I'm proposing that we find a place together that we can both contribute to. I'm proposing that I take some vacation days and help you transition back to work gradually. I'm proposing that we give ourselves time to fall in love properly instead of just falling into each other because we don't have any other choice. Nicholas looked around the perfect house one more time, then back at Imani and Grace. You know what? You're absolutely right. This place is beautiful, but it's not us. It's not who we are right now. No. Right now, we're the people who made a family work in your tiny apartment with a drawer for a crib and takeout containers for dinner. We're the people who figured out how to be happy with almost nothing except each other. Maybe we shouldn't be so quick to change that. Imani felt something warm unfurl in her chest. So what do? We go home, Nicholas said simply. To your apartment. And we figure out the rest as we go. As they gathered Grace's things and prepared to leave the perfect house behind, Imani felt lighter than she had in days. Nicholas wasn't trying to buy her anymore, wasn't trying to control the situation with grand gestures and overwhelming offers. He was just a man who wanted to build a life with her, one day at a time. In the car on the way back to her neighborhood, Grace fell asleep to the familiar motion, and Nicholas reached over to take Imani's hand. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For not letting me ruin this by making it about money. For knowing what we really need better than I do. Imani squeezed his hand. We'll figure it out together. Yeah, Nicholas said, and his smile was soft and real and completely without the desperation that had marked their first week together. We will. What do you think about Imani's decision to turn down Nicholas's offer? Was she right to insist on building something together instead of accepting his financial support? Comment below and subscribe to see how they create their new life as a family. 2 weeks later, Imani found herself standing in the living room of a modest 3-bedroom house in Virginia Highland, watching Nicholas attempt to assemble a crib while Grace supervised from her bouncy seat. The house was a compromise in every sense, not as small as Imani's apartment, not as grand as the Buckhead mansion, but something that felt like it could belong to both of them. I think you're putting that piece on backwards, Imani said, trying not to laugh as Nicholas studied the instruction manual with the same intensity he probably brought to multimillion-dollar construction contracts. These instructions were clearly written by someone who has never actually assembled furniture, Nicholas muttered, but he was smiling. Grace, what do you think? Does this look right to you? Grace responded with a happy gurgle that made both adults grin. At 3 weeks old, she was becoming more alert and interactive every day, and her personality was starting to emerge. She seemed to enjoy being the center of attention and had already figured out that different cries got different responses from her devoted caregivers. The house had been Imani's find, a 1920s bungalow that needed some work but had good bones and a price tag that made it possible for them to share the mortgage payment. Nicholas had wanted to buy it outright, but Imani had insisted on being an equal partner in every aspect of their new life together. "I still can't believe we're doing this," Imani said, looking around at the boxes that contained their combined possessions. Her modest furniture mixed with a few select pieces Nicholas had chosen from his penthouse created an eclectic but somehow cohesive whole. "Having second thoughts?" Nicholas asked, looking up from the crib assembly with concern. "No," Imani said immediately and realized she meant it completely. "I'm having first thoughts. Real thoughts about the future instead of just trying to get through each day." Nicholas abandoned the crib and came to stand beside her, Grace still in her bouncy seat between them. "It feels different, doesn't it? Planning something instead of just surviving it?" "Very different." Imani leaned against his shoulder, enjoying the simple comfort of his presence. "Better." They had spent the past 2 weeks taking things slowly, dating in the most unconventional way possible. Nicholas had returned to work 3 days a week, handling only the most essential meetings while Imani cared for Grace. On the days he worked, Imani would bring Grace to his office for lunch, giving him a break in the middle of his day and ensuring he didn't lose touch with his daughter's daily rhythms. In the evenings, they cooked dinner together in Imani's tiny kitchen, took turns walking Grace around the neighborhood, and talked about everything from their childhoods to their dreams for the future. They were learning each other outside of crisis mode, discovering that they actually enjoyed each other's company when they weren't just trying to survive. The physical attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface since that first night was still there, but they had agreed to take that aspect slowly too. They were sharing a bed now. Imani's apartment was too small for any other arrangement, but by mutual agreement, they were focusing on building emotional intimacy before adding physical complexity to their relationship. "Patricia called this morning," Nicholas said, settling into the rocking chair they had bought for Grace's new nursery. "The board meeting is next week, and they're expecting a full report on my situation. How do you feel about that?" Nicholas considered the question seriously. "Nervous, but not panicked the way I would have been a month ago. I think I'm ready to have that conversation with them." "What will you tell them?" "The truth. That I've had a personal crisis that required me to step back and reassess my priorities. That I'm ready to return to full-time work, but with some new boundaries about what that looks like." Imani nodded. They had talked about this extensively. Nicholas's need to remain committed to his company while also being present for Grace. It would require some creative solutions, but both of them were committed to making it work. "And you?" Nicholas asked. "How do you feel about going back to the hospital part-time?" Imani had negotiated a reduction to 3 12-hour shifts per week, which would give her more time with Grace while keeping her connected to the work she loved. The hospital had been surprisingly accommodating, especially when she explained that she was now caring for an infant. "Excited," she said honestly. "I love being with Grace, but I need the intellectual challenge of my work too. I think this balance will be good for all of us." Grace chose that moment to start fussing, the particular cry that meant she was hungry and not interested in waiting. Nicholas immediately got up to prepare a bottle while Imani lifted Grace from her seat. "There's my beautiful girl," Imani murmured, settling into the rocking chair with the baby. "Are you ready for dinner?" Watching Nicholas in their new kitchen, efficiently preparing Grace's bottle with the competence he had developed over the past weeks, Imani felt a deep sense of rightness about their choices. This wasn't the fairy tale she had imagined as a young woman. No dramatic proposal, no wedding dress, no traditional path to family. But it was real and solid and built on something stronger than romantic fantasy. "Here we go," Nicholas said, testing the bottle temperature before handing it to Imani. Grace latched on immediately, her tiny hand coming up to rest against Imani's finger as she drank. "I've been thinking about something," Nicholas said, settling on the floor beside the rocking chair. "What's that?" "About legal things. About making sure you have parental rights with Grace, about making sure we're both protected if something happens to me." Imani looked down at Grace, then back at Nicholas. "That's very practical of you. I talked to my lawyer yesterday. There are several options, but the simplest would be for me to petition the court to grant you legal guardianship. It would give you the right to make medical and educational decisions for Grace, and it would ensure that if something happened to me, you wouldn't lose her." Imani's throat tightened. The idea of losing Grace was something she tried not to think about, but she knew Nicholas was right to address it legally. What would that involve? Some paperwork, a background check, probably a home visit from a social worker. My lawyer says it should be straightforward given our living situation and Grace's obvious attachment to you. And you're sure about this? Nicholas reached up to touch Grace's tiny hand where it rested against Imani's finger. I've never been more sure of anything. You're her mother in every way that matters. The legal system should recognize that. Tears pricked Imani's eyes. Nicholas. I know we haven't talked about marriage, he continued softly. I know we're taking things slow and figuring out what we want our relationship to look like. But regardless of what happens between us romantically, I want you to know that Grace will always be your daughter too. Imani had to blink back tears. What if we don't work out? What if we're better as co-parents than as a couple? Then we figure out how to be the best co-parents we can be. But Grace doesn't lose another mother, and you don't lose the child you've been raising since she was 5 days old. Grace finished her bottle and looked up at Imani with those serious dark eyes that seemed to take in everything. Imani lifted her to her shoulder for burping, inhaling that sweet baby scent that had become as familiar as breathing. Okay, she said softly. Let's do it. Let's make it official. Nicholas's smile was radiant. Really? Really? Grace deserves to have her family legally recognized, whatever that family looks like. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Grace content against Imani's shoulder, Nicholas occasionally reaching up to stroke the baby's soft hair. Outside their new house, they could hear the sounds of their neighborhood children playing, dogs barking, the normal rhythm of life in a community where they were building their future. I never thought my life would look like this, Imani said eventually. Better or worse than you imagined? Imani looked around their new home, still full of boxes and half-assembled furniture, then down at Grace, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, then at Nicholas, who was watching both of them with such love in his eyes that it took her breath away. Different, she said. But perfect in its own way. Nicholas reached up to take her free hand, intertwining their fingers. I love you, Imani. Both of you. I love you too, she said, and realized it was the first time she had said the words out loud. I love this life we're building together. Grace made a soft sound in her sleep as if she approved, and Imani knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family. Not because circumstances had forced them together, but because they had chosen each other, day by day, decision by decision, until choosing each other had become as natural as breathing. As the sun set over their new neighborhood, casting golden light through the windows of their new home, Imani felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Complete contentment with exactly where she was and who she was with. They were home. 6 months later, Imani woke up to the sound of Grace babbling happily in her crib, the kind of morning chatter that meant she had slept well and was ready to start the day. The nursery they had finally finished assembling was across the hall from their bedroom, close enough to hear every sound but far enough to give everyone space to sleep. Your turn, Nicholas mumbled into his pillow, but he was already sitting up, running his hands through his dark hair that was now thoroughly mussed from sleep. I've got her, Imani said, stretching as she got out of bed. You have that early meeting with the Henderson team. The past 6 months had settled into a rhythm that worked for all three of them. Nicholas had returned to full-time work but with new boundaries that kept evenings and weekends sacred for family time. Imani had found her groove working 3 days a week at the hospital, spending the other days with Grace while Nicholas was in the office. The legal guardianship had gone through without complications, and Imani's name was now officially on all of Grace's documents as her legal parent. In the nursery, Grace was standing in her crib, holding onto the rail and bouncing on her chubby legs. At 8 months old, she was all personality, curious, determined, and completely convinced that she was the center of the universe. When she saw Imani, her face lit up with a grin that showed 2 tiny teeth. Good morning, beautiful girl, Imani said, lifting Grace out of the crib. Did you sleep well? Grace responded with a string of babbling that sounded almost like conversation, her small hands patting Imani's face with the enthusiastic affection of a baby who knew she was loved completely. In the kitchen, Nicholas was already making coffee and scrambling eggs, Grace's morning bottle warming in a bowl of hot water. He had become an expert at managing multiple tasks while keeping one eye on wherever Grace happened to be, a skill that had developed through necessity and practice. Patricia called yesterday while you were at work, he said, settling Grace in her high chair and handing her some small pieces of banana to keep her busy. The Atlanta Children's Hospital project got final approval. They want to start construction next month. That's wonderful, Imani said and meant it. The Children's Hospital had been Nicholas's passion project for the past several months, a way to channel his company's success into something that would benefit families like theirs. You must be proud. I keep thinking about all the families who will walk through those doors, Nicholas said, giving Grace her bottle while she played with her banana. Parents who are scared and overwhelmed, kids who need the best possible care. It feels like we're building something that really matters. Imani watched him feed their daughter, this man who had learned to balance running a multimillion-dollar company with the daily demands of parenthood, who had figured out how to be successful in business while never missing a bedtime story or a doctor's appointment. Speaking of building things that matter, Nicholas said carefully, I've been thinking about something. Oh. Nicholas looked nervous in a way that was unusual for him these days. I've been thinking about us. About our family. About making things more official. Imani's heart skipped, but she tried to keep her voice light. Official how? Instead of answering directly, Nicholas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Grace immediately reached for it, fascinated by the new object, but Nicholas held it just out of her grasp. I've been carrying this around for 2 weeks, he said, setting the box on the counter between them. Trying to figure out the right time, the right words, the right way to ask you something that feels bigger than any business deal I've ever negotiated. Imani stared at the box, her heart pounding. Nicholas. I know we said we were taking things slow, he continued quickly. I know we've built something good without needing marriage to make it real. But I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning, raise Grace together, maybe give her a little brother or sister someday if you want that too. Grace, sensing the importance of the moment even if she didn't understand it, had grown quiet, watching both adults with serious eyes. I want to be your husband, Nicholas said simply. Not because we need a piece of paper to prove we're a family, but because I want the whole world to know that you're mine and I'm yours and Grace is ours. Imani felt tears welling up in her eyes. Are you asking me to marry you? I'm asking if you'll let me love you forever, Nicholas said, opening the small box to reveal a simple, elegant ring that somehow managed to be both stunning and understated. Marriage, commitment ceremony, Vegas chapel, courthouse, I don't care how we do it. I just want to do it. Imani looked at the ring, then at Grace, who was now clapping her hands as if she approved of this development, then at Nicholas, who was watching her with hope and love and just a touch of the vulnerability she had first seen that night in her hallway. What about having more children? She asked softly. You know there's no guarantee that I can get pregnant. Then we'll figure out other options if that's what we want, Nicholas said immediately. Adoption, fertility treatments, being perfectly content with just Grace, whatever feels right for us. The only non-negotiable is that we do it together. And if your company needs you to travel? If there are late nights and early meetings and all the demands of running a business, then I'll handle them the same way I have been, with the understanding that my family comes first, always. Imani, you've taught me that success isn't just about profit margins and stock prices. It's about building a life that has meaning, raising children who know they're loved, being the kind of man who shows up for the people who matter most. Grace reached for the ring box again, and this time Nicholas let her have it, laughing as she immediately tried to put it in her mouth. I think that's a yes from Grace, he said. Imani wiped away tears that she hadn't realized were falling. What about from me? That depends, Nicholas said softly. What does your heart tell you? Imani looked around their kitchen, where Grace's artwork was stuck to the refrigerator with alphabet magnets, where Nicholas's business papers shared counter space with baby food jars and toy blocks. This wasn't the life she had planned when she was young and thought she knew what happiness looked like. It was better. My heart tells me that I've been married to you in every way that matters for months now, she said. My heart tells me that Grace is the luckiest little girl in the world to have a daddy who loves her enough to build a children's hospital. My heart tells me that what we have is real and strong and worth celebrating. Nicholas's smile was radiant. Is that a yes? That's a yes, Imani said, laughing as she reached for the ring box, which Grace reluctantly surrendered. That's a yes to all of it. Nicholas slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, like everything else about their unconventional love story. Grace clapped her hands and made happy sounds, as if she understood that something wonderful had just happened. When? Nicholas asked, kissing Imani softly. Soon, Imani said. But small. Just us and Grace and maybe a few friends. I don't need a big wedding. I just need you. You have me, Nicholas said. Both of you have me forever. As they stood in their kitchen, Grace babbling happily between them, Imani thought about the night 6 months ago when she had found a broken man and his newborn daughter on her doorstep. She had no way of knowing then that helping them would lead to this, a family built on love and trust and the daily choice to show up for each other. Grace threw a piece of banana, which landed in Nicholas's hair, and all three of them dissolved into laughter. It was a perfectly ordinary moment in what had become their perfectly extraordinary life. I love you, Imani said, the words coming as easily as breathing now. I love you too, Nicholas replied. Both of you. Forever. Outside, Atlanta was waking up to another day, but inside their modest house in Virginia Highland, the Bennett family was complete. Not because a billionaire had collapsed at a nurse's door, but because 3 people had chosen each other again and again, until choosing each other had become the foundation of everything they built together. Grace reached up with banana-covered hands, wanting to be lifted, and both her parents reached for her at the same time. She was caught between them, safe and loved and completely unaware that she was the miracle that had brought them all together. As Imani looked at her ring catching the morning light, she knew that sometimes the best fairy tales were the ones that started with broken people finding their way to each other. Sometimes happily ever after wasn't about being rescued by a prince, but about 2 people deciding to rescue each other, one day at a time, until they built something beautiful together. They had found their forever family and it was perfect,